All right, this is the 11:10 panel discussion on, it's entitled Next Steps in Question and Answer. We have a very esteemed, distinguished panel, august group, even today. I will start out with an initial discussion, and then we really want this to be a panel discussion that involves mostly questions from you all. And my starting question is, first of all, if you could introduce yourself, as opposed to me going through a long litany of a biography for each of you. And after a brief introduction, if you could provide the one thing, if you were king for a day, that you would like to see changed, researched, a piece of research that if you could have it tomorrow, it would be the best thing in the whole wide world, to inform a discussion, to set the stage, as Gary pointed out, for future research down the road. And then I'm hoping that the audience will have a lot better questions than that on a going forward basis. But we'll start there, and I'll start down with Dwayne.
Dwayne Spencer, BLM, Deputy State Director, Minerals and Lands, as of last week, previously Buffalo Field Office Manager. The one thing that I would like to see going forward is we've got a number within BLM of proposed avian mitigation plans, avian protection plans, and I would like to see one of those completed and implemented to give it a try to see what happens.
I'm Gwen McKee with Great Plains Wildlife Consulting, and y'all heard my introduction yesterday. It hasn't changed much. The one thing I guess I would like to see is a more collaborative effort among the industries, taking advantage of what we have learned and what we know works, and use those successful templates from industries like coal and apply them where they fit to industries like oil and gas, especially in overlap areas where both operators are working on exactly the same landscape.
What I would like to see is an understanding that most of us here are people who cannot affect policy, but we are people that you can work with under the present policy and under those current laws to achieve results that I think you would be happy with. And so again, that we're here to work with you, and that of course we understand the importance of the data that's needed to inform that. So the questions that you develop and come forward with to us are ones that we really want to hear, and we want efforts like this database to be able to answer. So just letting you know that we have an open door and very willing to work with you, and we think we can get it done under current policy, laws, and regulations.
I'm Doug Bremeyer, Deputy Chief of Wildlife with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and I think from our agency standpoint, what we would like to see is, adaptive management be applied, but that, a lot of the stakeholders need to be brought to the table so that we can all have our expertise voiced and be able to move forward with, some of the tools that have been discussed here. And I think each entity has their own level of expertise, and it would be great to hear from all the parties involved.
Hi, I'm Dolly Edmonds with Audubon Rockies. For those that are not familiar with Audubon Rockies, we are a nonprofit conservation organization, a regional office for National Audubon Society, so we cover Wyoming and Colorado. I'm going to put a slightly different spin on it. At Audubon, we approach things looking at it from a science, policy, but also an education component. And one thing that I'll add that I think is going to be slightly different from the other panelists is the opportunity to really build public support and gain exposure for the efforts that are being done in regards to raptors. Raptors are a very charismatic species, and I think there is a strong amount of interest in what happens with raptors. And Doug, your reference to the nest cams, it's spot on. I think people really enjoy seeing what's happening out there, and so I would encourage folks as we go forward and think about the next steps and how do we advance this, to think about the external communications portion of what's being done for raptor conservation.
And excuse me, I'm Tim Byer with the Forest Service, and I guess if I'm looking at what next, I would like to see us get the research in place to show what we can use instead of the buffers. When the buffers were put in our land management plan, that was the best science available at the time. And so if we are looking for something else to change, what we need to do is be able to have the science to show where we can go and how it works. Because I live in a land management situation where most of what we have to do is programmatic, so that everybody is treated equal. And therefore, I need that kind of research to be able to recommend to our policy managers the changes that would be out there. But we've got to give them something to hold on to.
My name is Tracy Jones. Just like we mentioned earlier, I work for Powder River Energy Corporation. And the instruction was if I was king for a day. And if I was king for a day, I would probably give an unlimited amount of resources to Gary to get the wind model available to the public and to everyone else so that we can make decisions on the same level. It's so disheartening to go through all this work, write a biological assessment, and then come to find out that there's siloed data out there, which does not lend very well to get projects done in a timely fashion. So,
Gary Beauvais, University of Wyoming. I would vote for Tracy for king. The one thing that I would do, and that clearly I'm going to be focused on quite a bit over the next 12 months, is to get this database, the statewide database of raptor nest monitoring information in place, get it populated with as much historic data as possible, but all the currently collected data, and have a really good protocol in place to get data into that database in a timely fashion, and a really useful user interface on the end for you all and all of our colleagues to interact with that data and pull it out and use it for the best use that we can put it to.
All right, I've had my shot. Very interested to hear what you all have to ask.
So first of all, thank you guys all for coming. And the commissioners can provide a public forum for communication, but if nobody participates, it doesn't do any good. So thank everybody in the room for coming and participating and being a part of this. And I think that was when we had the first Raptor Symposium. One of the big things that came out of it was a standardized, consolidated research database. And I think that's probably one of the big successes that we're seeing now. I guess a follow-up on Tracy and Dr. Beauvais' last thing is, how can the agencies promote or continual promotion of the use of the database? Because I think when that happens, the fundraising is going to be easy. When all the agencies and industry is using it, then I think the rest of it will fall into place. So what can you guys do better, or what can industry do to continually promote the continued use of that?
Who wants to start? Tracy.
well, that's a pretty good question. And like I said earlier, I think that probably one of the first steps is that agencies need to come together and kind of roll up their shirt sleeves and start working toward that effort. Siloed data is not a very good thing out there. It's not helping anybody. It's not lending to the solution. And I think if they can all come to terms that, hey, yes, we're gonna permit, or we're gonna work this permit off of the wind data, that's probably at least where I'd like to see it go.
I guess from my perspective, the biggest deal is getting all of us into the single database. by using wind as our database for all of this information, then we've got a single repository that everyone can go to and use equally. And then it's just a matter of the permissions that you're given to be able to get into all the access or part of the access based on some of the direction that wind has.
Yeah, I mean, we really do see our mission as service to the state. You know, as again, I think units at a land-grant university should be focused on. And so, you know, I think there are many things that the agencies could do, and I think they want to do it. I think making it clear to operators and consultants in the field, you know, that you collect the data, and here is the workflow that you need to go through, and maybe part of that required workflow or that recommended workflow is, and then submit your data to the statewide database. I think a lot of people, they'll collect their data, they come out of the field, they go through the usual channels with it, and then they're not sure what to do with it after that. And if that were to be made clear that this really should be, I mean, I don't know that you can require it, but it really should be submitted to the statewide database for maximum use. Make that a regular part of the workflow would be helpful.
And I think Gary has a really good point with that. And with Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of times the data isn't ours, it's yours. And so if industry or a certain company has decided that that data is proprietary, it will not be entered into a database like this. And so it's a willingness of industry to also share that data with their partners as well. And so there is, you know, we do receive a lot of data that isn't shared. And we'd like to be able to do that to actually help others in their endeavors.
I'm not an agency rep.
I don't have anything new to add. That's something we have a long history of, I think, getting good support for, sharing the databases, the LEC database. We can go to cultural databases. We have that as a state, and I think we do need to move that direction to encourage or get to the point of requiring that as the repository.
And I'll go quick. From the game and fish standpoint, we appreciate Gary's involvement and the university's support. We've been working with UW trying to take some existing databases and convert them to something that is more retrievable by other outside entities. And it's really important to have that one key agency or organization that can kind of oversee that development and vetting that data and making sure that it's all in a consistent format so that it isn't a nightmare to retrieve. And again, we support that effort, and I know Andrea's been working at it, and some of our staff in Cheyenne have also been engaged, and it's a huge step to take, but overall I think the benefits will be pretty far-reaching.
There's a lot of decision support tools out there, databases out there, and just making sure that as this is finalized and wrapped up, getting it out there not only amongst industry, making folks aware that it's available, but also to the wildlife professionals, the professional biologists, the researchers, and a couple of forums that can be done is through the Wildlife Society, the Wyoming chapter. Is a great way to touch base with a lot of folks. Also, the Wyoming Golden Eagle Working Group that was referenced yesterday. Along those lines, being able to provide trainings on how to submit data so folks, have structured training so folks understand what's available, the process for doing it. I think everyone has really full plates, and providing that forum would be fantastic.
Andrea, Game and Fish. During the break, several of us discussed the opportunity to, Lauren, maybe you should talk about this because you brought it up. I'm not a GIS person, but Lauren brought up, is there a way to, convert when we standardize that data sheet, Is there a way to convert it so people can use it on their, like make a shape file of it with drop-down boxes? If we're able to do that, whether Doug, it's through Game and Fish, one of our GIS folks, or through some other agency or entity, once we develop that, is that something that can just be then, ramped up to the database so they talk to one another?
Yes. When I talk to the technical staff at WIND, the guys actually in there coding the database, that is their dream world. Like I said yesterday, all we want is everybody collecting the same data the same way all the time, everywhere, forever, in the same format. And it is possible, and we do want to work towards this solution where there is a digital data form that can be brought into a tablet, even into a phone kind of a situation, that is useful, and that data can be collected in the field and backed up adequately in the field. Then when that's brought back into the office, it is literally the click of a button, and that goes into our database and goes into all those pre-database checks and goes up very efficiently, very quickly. There's no data transcription. That's where you get all your errors when you're typing the data from the paper forms into the spreadsheet. None of that. We can map that data form, all the fields in that data form we can map to fields in our database and automatically upload it. That's definitely the dream. It's moving a solid spreadsheet into a digital data form is there's a lot of art there, because the device that the biologist is using in the field usually has less real estate on the screen, and so you don't want them getting lost in that. But people know how to do that. People develop these kinds of functionalities all the time out there, and there's groups everywhere that are in business to develop digital data forms that can be expressed on a device very well. Yeah.
I'm going to digress from that question just a little bit, Andrea. I appreciate you asking it, but I'm going to bring up the elephant in the room, and that is there's a lot of sensitive data out there as well. At Powder River Energy, we have a very good understanding of that with our agencies and such. You just don't want things like Indian artifacts and even older artifacts, the locations revealed. You want to make those decisions at a level that's appropriate, and we'll keep that stuff confidential. At Powder River, we segregate our data so that the only folks that are actually seeing that information are the people that are doing the permitting. That's kind of important too, something to keep in mind here. It's going to be very difficult to parse that information and make it available to the people that actually make the decisions. Did you want to?
Yeah, we recognize that there's always going to be some data out there that just is not going to be submitted to the database. People, for whatever reason, have data that they just want to keep within their company, within their group for some reason, and not get it to the database. That's fine. That happens with all sorts of wildlife data. It happens with lots of ecological data, that there's just a particular situation where that data doesn't go into a clearinghouse. I think with the data sensitivity protocols that we've put in place, we've taken care of a lot of those concerns, but there will always be some data out there that is not available to everybody, and that's just the world.
Jim Willicks, Converse County. And for any of you up there, one of the things that at my level that drives me crazy is time. Dave talked about their 17-year process. Now, that's only 3 presidential administrations, 3 governors, and how many number of administrators that have turned over in that time. What ideas do you have to accelerate the science part of it? And I'm not smart enough to know processes on the science side, but there's tons of bottlenecks in the process, and one of them is time. And I'm not talking about the EIS or any of those in the times that are there on the policy side. What ability do we have to accelerate, and I'm using the term accelerate the science because I don't have a better term for it, that then helps reduce these time frames so we're making decisions that are relevant for the time when we started them and at the end of them, and this is one of those bottlenecks, and I'd even let Ryan tackle it from that side, but can we accelerate the science? And maybe Mike's aerial discussion yesterday leads us to some of that, but I'm just curious, is there a way to reduce the time needed on the science part of it so that the policy decisions can be made in a quicker way? And entering the data quicker electronically is maybe one of them. Is there others from anybody up there?
Well, that's one of the things that frustrates at least the biologists in our office, because at least in the true science, the investigation and research that goes on, we have the same problem. We bring up a topic and turn it over to research to deal with it, and 3 to 5 to 7 years later, we get the information back. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess depends on your approach, we don't want to make decisions based on 1 year's analysis. It needs to have the time to go in there. And for many of us, from that perspective at least, I'm learning I just have to be patient and hopefully answer the question well enough so that it's relevant in 5 years as much as it is today. But to be able to accelerate our research on the ground, we've yet to find a way to actually make something happen faster than that, because you have to look at several years. Otherwise, your data is not valid enough and robust enough to make decisions that you folks want us to make. So I guess from my perspective, I don't know where you can make that to help. The only thing I can see that helps is by adding money so they can get started sooner.
Thanks, Tim. I think you're exactly right. It just, a lot of the data collection efforts take time so that you have some environmental variability that you can account for, and maybe some population changes that may occur as well. It's at a stage in technology right now, we're at a pretty good point though as well, because we can have iridium radio collars, or and some of the technological advances for data collection that do help. But sample size is always a factor, and like Tim says, you've got to have a collection of that data over a series of time to account for some of that variability that you can encounter in a population or in the environment.
And what I would like to say is that, in fact, what you are doing now is facilitating people in the future to be able to address this in a quicker fashion, because they will have the historical data to look at. So, it's you're on the frontier of it, and you're creating, a method, a way for people in the future to benefit. And that's how it will shorten the time frame for those individuals, but maybe not for you right now.
And just to build on that, and also what Gary said earlier today, a lot of information is there, but you don't know where it is necessarily. It's stored in different areas or whatever. So it kind of circles back for me to collaboration. Call up somebody and say, where do the coal mines send their annual reports? Oh, DEQ, I didn't think of that. Just really simple steps like that can help you start to find out if you already know more than you realize, or somebody else does. And so I think that might, in the short term anyway, help you get your hands on some information that might be helpful.
I think that's pretty important, that a lot of questions that if we were to as researchers, if we were to go out into the field and essentially ask the birds to answer a question for us, if the question was, we can make it something simple. What is the average clutch size for a ferruginous hawk in northeastern Wyoming? Then we're on the bird schedule, and we're going to have to wait 2-3 years before we have reliable data. But that data is out there. It can happen a lot faster if we don't first take the perspective that we have to go out there and estimate it ourselves, but we go back to the existing science, the literature, the expert knowledge, everything out there, and we look for the answer there. Then we can answer that really without asking any new birds to tell us that. It's been answered. And I think that taking the perspective that before we start to answer a question in a brand new way, we should first find out if it has already been answered. That's one way to accelerate the science part of that, I think. It's we say this in a couple of different contexts, and it makes you sound like some kind of Confucian philosopher, but there's a difference between I don't know and it is not known. And in order to know if it is not known, you first must know that it is not known. And it takes work, a little bit of work to figure that out. But that's one way to accelerate it, is go back to the existing science and ask, is the information there? Oh, there it is. Let's summarize it, let's structure it, let's do the appropriate quantitative work, and then get it out there.
And I also think that one thing that this group has to task ourselves with is understanding what questions the statewide database will be able to answer for us, and when we'll still need the project level monitoring. Those can be different. The project level monitoring can inform the statewide database. How can the statewide database inform project level issues?
This is Kyle Wentland with Land Quality with the State of Wyoming. I'm going to go further down the path that Gary and Gwen hit on. How much of this today, and to maybe address some of Jim's question, is really a due diligence and planning component rather than a data shortfall?
I don't know. I mean, I think you know, as a scientist, I think the due diligence, we do have a due diligence that we have to do, again, before we go out and tackle a question in a brand new way. It's on us to make sure it hasn't been answered already. We have to do that. And I think the data is there for a lot of important questions. I don't think it's a lack of data. I think it's a lack of accessibility to that data, right? It's in scattered journal articles, it's in a couple of technical reports, it's in hard to get places. It hasn't been consolidated, it hasn't been summarized in an accurate way, and it hasn't been put out there in a way that everybody can access it in a useful form. You know, one thing we hear from managers and from developers all the time is science is great, but if you can't map it, we really can't use it. And there's a lot of good science that could be made spatial that isn't. I think that's, you know, part of our responsibility too. Take this good stuff. If it's a habitat use equation that sits there on the page, you know, Tim can't take that tomorrow and start using it. But if we can put that in the GIS and express it spatially and give you that map, suddenly it makes sense and it's useful. I think that's part of the due diligence, I think.
I guess one of the other answers that I have, excuse me, from a land management standpoint is we get windows of opportunity where I really get to dig into the literature. That's our planning time when we set our land management plans in place. Our plans for the Forest Service, you heard Dwayne talk about the stuff for BLM, but ours was a 2002 plan. And so when we did that, we did a lot of the research. That's how we established our buffers and those kinds of things. All of us in the wildlife program in our office try to keep up to date with the literature that's coming through. But we're project managers. We actually are working on the ground. We don't get to spend a lot of time looking at the new research that's coming out. So from my perspective, I get windows of opportunity and then a little dribbling along the way. And so the biggest changes that happen for us, I live and die by the land management plan. And so my biggest opportunity for looking at that new information and being able to do something with it is during the planning effort when our plans are revised. And so to change things as we go along throughout the plan becomes one of those things. It takes a forest plan amendment or a grassland plan amendment to do that. Those are expensive, they're time consuming. You have to be able to justify all of the involvement for the product you're getting back out, as opposed to waiting till the next season when you get a chance to look at the entire plan. So to answer your question, we have windows of opportunity, but it's not always an ongoing process as much as we'd like.
Just for my own benefit, I wanted to clarify that question. I thought you were asking how many of these instances are that they might have had the data, but they just didn't take opportunity or plan well enough. So I just want to clarify that because it seemed like you guys were coming at it from a different perspective. I thought I was confused.
And,
I was
to
thinking,
continue- go ahead.
there's an additional part to the question because there is plenty of data and you can plan, but clearly why we're all here is because the maps are covered with circles and you're going to need some discretionary decisions depending what program area you work with to make that decision. Because in a lot of circumstances, if you just looked at the map with circles, you would say you can't do anything in Campbell County or Johnson County. We know that's not true, so there's additional information that we need all the time to help determine when we are doing something and when we permit it and how you can approach that. Because in certain circumstances, you're right, we have the data. If they plan to avoid it all, it is very, very simple, but that seems like that rarely occurs with most projects.
Yeah, from my perspective, to answer your question, I hope maybe a little better, we do look at all the data that was available at any time when we're looking at projects. That's one of the situations that's the good part of my job, when I actually do get to dig into the data and look at all the information that's available. So at any given time when we're looking at specific projects, we are trying to review as much of the data as we can get our hands on. That's oftentimes the complaint between the decision makers and the specialists, is that there's never enough data. I want more. And so trying to get that, but when we have made the decisions, it's based on as much information as we can get our hands on at that time.
So from the perspective of applying for permits or getting permissions to route power line in different areas, I will tell you this, what I've learned over the years is that you can distinctly tell, and I hope my bosses cover their ears, but you can distinctly tell when we've provided enough information to make a decision and when we haven't. And if we don't do the due diligence and learn what it takes to get that information, then your project's already in jeopardy. So a good example is, just not Raptor related, but culturally related. I've heard people say, well, dang it, I can't get my cultural surveys done. Well, yeah, it's December. You've got to consider some of these things when you're trying to get those permits.
Well, good morning, everyone. Pete Obermueller, Executive Director of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association, which means the dubious distinction of representing all 93 commissioners in all 23 counties. Turns out they don't all agree on these sorts of things. It's weird. But I've really appreciated this time because I'm in the policy realm basically 100% of the time. I don't spend a lot of time in the science realm. So I like coming to this. I liked it 2 years ago. I like this one because it's important for me to be exposed to what you're working on in the science field because it colors what I do. But the opposite is true. And so, Ryan's back there sort of lurking behind you all. I invite him to respond to this too. I have sort of two thoughts and questions that I wanted to ask. Number one, there's a lot of agency personnel, industry, that sort of thing. But then you've got the Converse and Campbell commissioners here in the room. But I've got obviously, as I said, 90 some other commissioners around the state who are not here. And what they have to do in the context of all of this is turn around to their constituents and explain what actions they're taking to help with a particular issue. And the science is one input on that. But any given constituent might say to an elected representative of the county, your science be damned, I need to make a living. What are you doing about that? And so I'm just curious, on that sense, I'm curious to know, to what extent you feel like industry or your agencies are sort of aware of that or prepared to sort of help those of us who want to be helpful to be able to communicate that to constituents, number one. And then number two, on the flip side of that, I think a lot of commissioners realize that they also need to be helpful in the other way, and lots of counties, Campbell, Converse, others are willing to put in resources, and my association and the state. I think it's interesting that lots of other states are out there trying to copy our federal natural resource policy account, and we were the first ones to do it, and it's been very, very helpful, and other states are looking at that as a tool. But sometimes it's difficult for us to decide what's the right place to put our resources so that we can turn around to our constituents and say we've been helpful and here's how we've been helpful. So the second question is, the first question is, how cognitive are you of that political need? And then two, what would your advice be to my members and commissioners about how to be helpful and engaged in this process? And Ryan, please feel free to jump in too.
I can start from a BLM perspective. We are very, very aware of folks need to make a living. We hear that quite often, and very understanding of that. And so that is come into decision, and the hard part is then explaining the balance of the regulation and processes that we need to follow and live with, yet also dealing with the reality of it is that we have not made the state of Wyoming a no surface occupancy zone, recognizing that we need to deal with the issues and do it. And I think a lot of the misunderstanding is, I guess I'll make the plug. That's why it's very important for the various governmental agencies to participate as cooperating agencies when we're doing our NEPA documents and all of that. I realize it's a real trudge. It's not really exciting sometimes, and you think, what does this have to do with anything? Until you get here and you're dealing with a project and you realize, as Tim has brought up, our lives start with, are you in conformance with your plan? That's the very first question you have. And if the answer is no, you don't go to the next step until you take care of that deficiency. And so I think that's really important to have that local governmental involvement on that, to relay that, how that all fits together. And I gotta say, in Northeast Wyoming, it is very difficult because there is split estate and you have federal minerals. So there's always that natural tension here on trying to deal with a federal action while not owning the surface. If you're on BLM and BLM, they can say, okay, well, if they want to, and I just make things up, if they want to be crazy and do that decision, we understand. That's BLM. But when you're doing it on split estate, it takes on a whole nother level to have that explanation and understanding on why we're complying with various rules and laws and how we make that decision. That in the end of the day, we just have to disclose it and say, this may be significant, which leads us on another step, or hey, it's not significant, here's how we go forward. But we got to get through our steps.
And I'd like to add that I think one of the very productive things that you're doing and can take back to your constituents is that, you know, as regards this question of why, you know, working with different agencies and feeling like they have different requirements that they're imposing. And what you're doing here, and I think it's really productive, is really get the agencies to work together. And then you get that one response. And I think, you know, again, with these migratory bird conservation plans that the Buffalo office is working on, and bringing the other agencies into, that's where you do get that consistency in response and one response. And this effort here, where you're getting the agencies to work together, and industry and all the partners in developing a database, I mean, that's very good work, and that's something you can take back as well as something that's really going to, you know, advance our understanding as to what our resources are out there, what the impacts are, and how we can address that and conserve our species. So, good job.
You're doing good stuff.
Well, I think from the state standpoint, the Game and Fish is very attuned to our publics and our constituents. And when it comes to, you know, the regulatory mechanisms in place or the policies for raptors, we're not quite as involved as we are with our big game management, because a lot of our field personnel are engaged with the county commission's constituents on a day-to-day basis in terms of the large game or the big game animals. I would say that you know, the commission can be engaged when there's projects coming up and certainly interact with our personnel at any time. All of our staff in our regional offices, like Andrea, are very attuned to the issues and the policies that we have, and are more than willing to engage with any of the constituents that you guys have, and as well as they're the same constituents that we have, and we're always willing to engage in that dialogue.
That's why I was going to let Doug go ahead first. Is I'm echoing a lot of what's already been said. From the Forest Service's standpoint, I know that my leadership is very interested in working with the county commissioners on a variety of topics. And not only they're not only aware of the issues that you folks are trying to work with, but they're also willing to come alongside and partner with you. I know that my leadership has assigned us as specialists several times to go to county commission meetings or to other meetings where the county commissioners have asked us to attend, to have a specialist come in and explain some of the things that don't necessarily have the expertise at the commission level. And so I've gone in at times and explained the ESA, some of our Raptor issues, things like that. So I would say, as you talk to your commissioners, from the Forest Service's standpoint at least, we're willing to not only understand your problem, but we're also willing to stand beside you and help explain what's going on. We would like to be involved as a partner with you. We're willing to come up and stand beside you.
From a slightly different perspective, as a private contractor working for the energy industry, we have a similar situation though. Our energy clients want to know, why do I have to do this? How can I do this faster? How can I get around this? So it's very similar to the county commissioners wanting to know, what can we do to move forward? We just want to go forward. And so to me, it's kind of it is communication, but it's almost marketing, helping folks understand that it's in their best interest to do things a certain way. They may have more flexibility down the line if they make an investment on the front end of some proactive efforts, for example, or working collaboratively at the front end of their project with the agency right up front, so that they know what's out there, working with their neighbors, whether it's the same industry or not, working collaboratively as contractors, data sharing, which we do. And so from my perspective, in a similar situation but different, it's a marketing thing. I know this is a hassle to do this, but look what you're going to get down the line. The next time this happens, you will have established a reputation and an example that you can pull from, and then you get more flexibility down the line that you don't have up front because you have no foundation to stand on. And so I think educating the commissioners of where they can collaboratively work with others, just like we educate our clients to the best of our abilities on how taking this step can actually get you farther down the line than it seems like right at that moment.
Pete, the only thing I would add is what probably the federal partners can't say right now, and that is it won't be facilitated by draconian budget cuts within USDA and DOI. And you know from your previous life what that looks like in terms of the politics, but I think that we need a scalpel and not a blunt instrument in terms of budget, and I think we have to be mindful that, you know, as we try to stand up regulatory take regimes, if that's what we want, it all takes people, it takes time, and that is going to require some organizational efficiencies within the agencies, but there is a threshold that they just have to have resources to get a lot of this done. And I would argue, given our experience in the past administration, we should have those resources here and not in Washington, and we should disperse them where the extraction, where the impact, where the potential benefit is, and that's here, whether that's in the Land and Water Conservation Fund, whether that's in individual agency budgets. These guys can't talk about their budgets, but that's, I think, the reality we're going to be butting up against in the coming months.
So they handed to me again, and Rusty pointed out, you got to dumb it down for commissioners. And it pigtails a little bit with Pete's question. We all have water cooler talk, and we go back. We're in a nice public forum, and we're being pretty polite. So when you go back and talk about policymakers, if you're a scientist or if you're a policy person up there, what do you go back and say to you? They just don't get X. As you're trying to explain to, I didn't understand the science, and 2 years ago I learned a lot more than I ever had. But when you go back and talk about us, and us can be another agency, commissioners, what do you go back and say? They still don't get. What do we not get that Pete was alluding to that will help us help you, and vice versa? I think we have always said, Commissioners have always said scientists don't understand the socioeconomic part of what we're doing, that the biological scientists don't understand the socioeconomic impact that we deal with in our constituents that beat us up in the grocery store. What do we still not get from your vantage point? Blunt's okay. I can take it.
Yeah, well, maybe you can hear me anyway. I think the thing that sometimes I think people don't get is that we actually can help you, and we can help you get it done. And maybe that's not the science answer, but that we're here for you, and we're willing to work with you, and we can do it under even the current policies and regulations. You know, there's that opportunity, and we're open to innovation and new ways of looking at things, and so bring that forward. You know, we welcome.
I will say the thing that probably the message gets confused on a lot of times is, I would say the bulk of the time, we're not really talking about if it happens, it's how it's going to happen there, and that oftentimes the discussion's centered around that people, it's being portrayed as if it's going to happen there. I mean, we have some valid existing rights. We make our land use. I keep coming back to that resource management plan decision that we lay it out there, and it's rarely do you see within the state areas just closed to everything. So that puts us as how are we going to do it there? And so that gets lost in a lot of emotion there. It's like BLM or Forest Service is saying it's not going to happen. That's usually not what the conversation is. It's how it's going to happen.
I guess from my perspective, there it is, now it's on. From my perspective, one of the things that seems like the real issues out there, and you had said it earlier, Jim, is I want it now. And unfortunately in the arenas, both in living in a federal agency arena as well as in a scientific arena, now for me sometimes the closest now is 3 to 5 years out. That's the arena I have to live in. And so where your constituents are saying, by next drilling season, I need this. And that's the disconnect, is where we live versus where they'd like for us to live. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest issues, is trying to find a timeline in there that we all can reasonably operate in.
Gregory Kennett, ERG. Being a contractor working with governments and NGOs and industry, one of the things that we need to think about in the next steps, what are concrete items that we can do in, say, the next 2 years? So I'd ask each panelist to think about, from a conservation or development perspective, from both perspectives, what is the one thing you would recommend to either the conservation or development community that they could do to improve the efficiency, some sort of efficiency within the next 2 years?
I guess I'll take a first shot at it, before somebody steals mine anyway. For all the industries that I work with, not only just the mineral industry, but agricultural and others, is early planning and getting your information and your requests into us early. Because as we all know in this area, between the mineral development as well as agriculture and recreation going on, there's a lot of stuff happening out there. And unfortunately, I think many of the companies that we deal with, many of the industries that we deal with, see themselves as that first person that should be at the table. And so there's an awful lot on our plates that are going on. So early planning with the patience of knowing that within the next 2 years we'll be working on it. But much like what Tom was talking about earlier, the big EIS is looking at several of the different oil and gas development fields. Those take time, but they're planning now while the finances for oil and gas are low. The budget's not there to be drilling a lot. So this is the time to be analyzing. And so for folks to be out there and not wait till the market comes back up and then say, now I want to go in September, because that becomes an issue for me and organization on our side of the fence. And so early planning with that in place probably is the first single one I can think of.
And I would say, while we're still finalizing the database and getting that up to speed, because as Gary said, it'll be another year to two before that's fully accessible, make full use of existing information. You know, it's out there, and I understand that it's stored in different places, and that's why I said before, just call somebody, call your neighbor that works at a coal mine or something, call somebody to find out where the existing information is so that you can improve your efficiency right now while we wait for this more compressed opportunity to minimize the potential for conflicts that impact your operations by planning ahead through accessing existing information.
Clearly, I don't work for a company, a development company, or a state agency, or a federal agency, so I can say anything about them because I'm obviously an expert, right? But I would echo what Ryan said earlier. We interact with the land management agencies all the time, and we want things to be done efficiently too. And one thing that is clearly constraining them right now is people, and people means budget. If you want things done well and you want them done fast, that's going to take people at the BLM, at the Forest Service, at the Fish and Wildlife Service, at the Game and Fish Department, and people cost money, and if budgets are cut, that it's hard to do that. I think it's hard to get around that cold hard fact that fast, good, efficient work requires money and people to do it at the agencies. That would require a king for a day kind of a thing, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know how to influence federal budgets, so maybe you could.
So Audubon was at the 2015 Symposium. It wasn't myself, it was a colleague of mine. But one thing that Audubon is part of is a lot of forums on a lot of working groups, and there is something really valuable in maintaining the momentum and the relationship building. And so I think there's been some good ideas here, and I'm curious as to what the next steps are. I think everyone has really full plates, but identifying early on leadership and clear next steps for accountability. It would be a shame to have all the good ideas that were talked about here not go anywhere. So I just want to plug that to not lose that momentum.
I was also going to add on to that same thought is that Deputy Director John Kennedy, when he delivered a message from the governor's office, was to maintain those meaningful partnerships early on and help keep people at the table early so that you can identify potential issues and possible mitigation up front so that it saves you time later on.
And ditto to everything that was said here. And one of the things I'd like to focus our attention back on is that in addition to the biological data that we need to assist industry in project development, is we need industry to really be able to help us identify the species that will be impacted and actually what those impacts are. And sometimes I think it's not as clear as it could be how species can be impacted, and maybe that's something to think about in the database and how we want to address that in a database.
And I'll take the beauty of the last one by using all their great comments, but the big things is, like Gwen said, use the existing data to then, like Tim said, develop your project. And when I say develop your project, I think people need to think really comprehensively and have probably a bigger, using the government term, interdisciplinary team with that project planning, because you can't just let the biologist plan the project, because then you get the engineers involved, you find out it's not feasible. So it's been it's a little struggle to drag in people who traditionally don't listen to those type things there, and then have them in at the earliest moment to understand what's going on the ground biologically, and then for the biologists to understand what's going on with the actual project and integrate those two to come up with something. I think that's really a key point to get narrowed in, because what we've experienced is that we go back and forth a little bit, even internally on that, and we'll find out, wow, this makes really good sense, and then the engineer turns around and goes, nope, can't make that work because we can't measure it properly. Then we flip back with another adjustment. So getting people at the table from all different interdisciplinary areas to come up with it.
I'm going to just comment a little bit on the commissioner's question. What do we go back and talk about? What do they not get? And I guess I'm guilty of doing it like 3 times already, so I feel like I should step up and say our buffers have taken a big hit during this symposium, and they're pretty much a starting point for pre-planning. You get a lot of professional judgment and site-specific things that go into it, but as was mentioned earlier, the MBTA was drafted, and the big impact at that time was more of a direct impact from harvest, and so they addressed it without any prohibition to disturbance or harassment to migratory birds at that time. But you could have population level impacts without having any direct harvest of the migratory birds. So when we're dealing with landscape level habitat alterations and occupancy by energy development, the MBT alone may not be sufficient for that sort of thing. And other than short of collaring every pair of birds out there, it seems like those buffers might be the best option, at least in terms of economically feasible options.
Well, if they are the best option, then that's a good option to go with. But if it's not, I mean, we have other ways of addressing that with the long-term conservation, and that really is the kind of the backbone of these migratory bird conservation plans, would be to not only avoid the likelihood of take, but promote the long-term conservation of the species that occur in that area. And there are ways to do that, not using nest buffers, using that as maybe one tool within a box of tools. But it's all, and again, it's just based on the amount of information we have as far as being able to delineate territories. And there's ways to delineate territories without radio tagging birds as well. And that's where the science comes in. And so I think there's opportunity here.
Mike Hillis, ERG. So one of the requirements of assessing risks of an activity is to understand the magnitude of the risk, where it is, how much is it, how is it arranged, et cetera. Gary Williams did a good job of that yesterday with assessing risks of electrocution on golden eagles at a statewide level. There's kind of been an undercurrent of the last several years that energy extraction is so significant in Wyoming that without these fairly substantial mitigation measures, we'll pay a high price in terms of lost wildlife values or whatever. And that may be very, very well true. What I typically don't see is a detailed assessment of what the footprint of energy extraction is. You know, the biggest scale I ever see is something like Pinedale Anticline, where you look at and go, wow, that's a pretty significant impact. But if you jump back to a county or a statewide level, you get a real different context. So the question is, do we routinely understand that footprint at those different scales? And I realize, you know, energy is a moving target and the footprint varies by species, but it seems to me that understanding that, be able to dialogue that is important to reach our publics in terms of understanding the relationships. Certainly essential from a broad scale assessment in terms of species risk or things like species viability at broader scales.
So by footprint, you're talking about the actual spatial impact?
Exactly.
At a statewide scale?
Yep.
I mean, that I have seen estimates of that, and there are groups, you know, working to update those constituent maps. I know there's lots of associated efforts. There's the disturbance density calculation tool for, that's growing out of the sage grouse effort that's doing that, and it's pulling together a lot of those remotely sensed layers on surface disturbance and combining them in effective ways. The State Wildlife Action Plan incorporates what they call a human footprint layer that was developed by a group in the state that is a state map where it combines roads and railroads and developed areas and oil and gas wells and so on and so forth up to the statewide scale and provides that. Like any spatial exercise, it's not as easy as that. There's some estimation that goes on, a little bit of modeling that goes on, so you can get slightly different pictures based on who does it. But I think that data's out there. I don't know that it gets marketed out there or distributed out there very, very well. It goes into particular projects, but I think there are some pretty good estimates of that.
So when you build models to look at species risks over time, theoretically that could be incorporated into that.
Absolutely. I know when my group builds a predictive distribution model of given species, that goes in there as a predictive layer for some species. And it'll go in for some species and turn out not to be a very powerful layer, and so we throw it out in the end. But for others, it can be. Yeah.
So maybe to extend the question to the Forest Service and BLM, when you guys do cumulative effects analysis with energy and other stuff, do you generally feel comfortable with the level of information you have in doing those assessments?
Sure. When BLM puts together a resource management plan, one of the first starting points is a reasonable foreseeable development scenario, which outlines the projected amount of predominantly mineral development out there. Then we're also going to estimate the other surface-related impacts, could be right-of-ways, power lines, things like that. So that's one of the first starting points when we do the resource management plan, to get that nailed down and get that number that then is projected across what it's going to look like in the landscape, whether how big it is or small and concentrated it is, and then that's rolled up into the analysis when we're looking at the various impacts, environmental consequences. That's the baseline that we use to forecast that. After that's done, moving forward, basically your starting point, I keep talking about the resource management plan conformance, is your step one is, are you still within that cumulative impact threshold that you put based upon that reasonable foreseeable development scenario out there. So sometimes that's updated along the way, depending on the project scale that comes on. You've got some relatively big projects come in and you might see a reasonable foreseeable development scenario that maybe looks a little bit lower. What you'll typically find then is that will update and amend the RFD, I'll quit saying reasonable foreseeable development scenario, within the RMP. So it is taken into account. I keep coming back to raptors. Raptors are a little bit more difficult than the birds because, not like the other species that I mentioned earlier, they don't say, here's your number that you have in that area, and this scenario will impact 13 of them, and this one. So it's very hard to tie that together from a pure number aspect to look at it. So that's the difficulty of it.
And everything that Dwayne said fits with the Forest Service as well. A couple of the other things I'd add. In our management plan, we develop different management areas across the landscape that we work on. So along the coal mines and where a lot of our heavy oil and gas has been going on, that area is actually designated as a minerals area where we're looking at developing minerals. So when they developed the reasonable foreseeable development scenario, we looked at that and we anticipated those areas where we expected significant impacts to come from that kind of a development. In addition to that, the BLM sends out to us, I believe it's annually or quarterly, a copy of all of the known development sites, all the oil and gas wells show up on a CD that we have in-house, so that when I'm looking at a project, I can display in my GIS actually where all of our fields are and where the development's at, so that as I look at projects, I can take and look at that spatially to evaluate how we're starting to impede on some areas and how that's affecting some of the goals set up in our plan. So we do look at it. It's probably not as robust as what you'd like to see, but it is in the system and it is some of the things that we do, and the goals and objectives of each one of the management areas can be very different. So we have some that are very much a backcountry, native habitat type of a situation, all the way up to the mineral development area for the mines and the coal or oil and gas.
Andrea, Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I'd like to shift just for a brief moment to our number 2 industry in the state, and that's tourism. And this affects, this will affect everybody in every county. We have world-class wildlife resources here. We have wide open spaces. We have accessible public land. We have cultural resources. We have people that come here and spend money in every single county. And I'd like to see us work together to promote that industry as well. And I'd like to hear each of your take on how you think that might come to fruition.
I don't know. Again, I'm saying this a lot up here. It's critical, right? It's the number 2 industry, exactly. People come here to see wildlife. They come here to see wide open spaces. They come here to recreate in and around wild and landscapes. And I think we all realize that's part of the reason why we're here, right? Nobody here wants any species of raptor to go extinct or to go away. We got to figure out how to do all of this at once. I don't know how to do that. Although I do know, and I won't take too long on this because I think the previous discussion, this discussion, get a little bit back to the commissioner's comment from earlier about what maybe commissioners don't get. I don't know if this is what commissioners don't get, but I know when biologists talk to the public a lot, just people off the street, there's a little bit of a disconnect there because with biologists, we're interested in the population as the population of a given species as the unit of concern. A lot of people tend to be interested in individuals within that population or an individual nest perhaps. And maybe, what I'm hearing here from a lot of folks is that when you're working a project in the field, you're interested in what happens to this nest right here. In a sense, biologists aren't terribly interested in that, except that it's a component of a population. And our interest when we're asked, okay, how do we conserve this population or how do we maintain it for other uses like tourism or things like that, is we want to keep the population viable over a long period. That doesn't mean this nest or that nest, when we have to pour all these resources into that. It means we have to consider the population as a whole and what happens on average across a long time span. So that might be one disconnect. I think some people get it out there. I think it gets into this issue of cumulative effects that I think some people have a hard time getting their head around too, that populations can die a death of 1,000 cuts, and that has impacts on other economically important activity in the state.
And well, all Fish and Wildlife Service has to do is live up to our mission, and that's to work with others to conserve our wildlife trust resources. So we're working towards that.
I guess from a land management, I keep jumping right in front of you, Doug, I'm sorry. From a land management standpoint, we have a recreation program, and we try to work with folks, and I get an awful lot of folks that are specifically interested in the wildlife resources and coming to the national grasslands or the national forest to see those resources and making tours. When I look at those folks, I look at them from 2 different opportunities, 2 different ways of looking at them from a resource. One is I would provide a resource for them so they can actually go out and see and educate themselves, but it's also a public education for them so that the more folks I can get involved with that see what we do and how we mix the minerals industry with the ag industry and still have the wildlife out there, I feel like I'm building a constituency out there so that when we're trying to look at newer innovative things like we're talking about here, I have some sort of a rapport with some of the public so that they can see what we're doing. If all you do is read about it in the newspaper someplace, we lose that. The one problem I guess I see in them that might be applicable here, especially for the county commissioners, they may be able to help it, is to bring us together into a collaborative type of agreements so that the Forest Service isn't doing their neat little thing with recreation over here, BLM's doing something else, the Game and Fish has got some interesting programs they've got going, but we're all out there doing things independently. And with some exceptions, I don't know that the coordination in that arena is the best. And with the mineral industry, as we see folks coming in, that's a collateral issue that goes along with a lot of the folks that come here. When they come out, they do their job, but they still get downtime. And we see them coming out and using the public lands in particular, private lands incidentally that they maybe shouldn't have been doing. But when they come out, if we can help direct those folks, then we still build that constituency so that if I've got to come in as a biologist and talk to one of the industry folks, if they've been out and seen the area, we're working with them through a recreational standpoint, it gives a different perspective than if all they've done is come up here, drill, go home, watch the YouTube, and turn around and get back out and back out to the wells again. Those are two different people, and the way I can work with those folks is very different. So I can see recreation as an opportunity for us to better involve our people in some collaboration.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's something that our agency is very attuned to, but we kind of struggle with it because a lot of our funding base, of course, comes from license fee dollars. And all constituents have the opportunity to provide feedback to the agency in terms of our big game management goals. But for non-game, it's kind of, they fall under a little bit more of the umbrella approach where, you know, some of our habitat projects and some of our educational programs try and inform people about all wildlife, and we're always attuned to that, and as you know, our funding mechanism is we're looking at other options for that to try and take advantage of that number 2 industry, and at some point maybe we'll be able to tap into that and continue to educate people about the value of important habitats and all the species that are there. So.
Through my career, I've come a long way. My background is actually in research. Have a graduate degree looking at pronghorn antelope, and then have sort of stumbled into the policy arena and trying to ensure that the science is incorporated into policy decisions and management decisions. Well, more recently, recognizing the value of public engagement and public education in all of this. So I personally am evolving in this. And that question talking about tourism and recreation screams in my head marketing. I think there are opportunities that the public wants to hear about and that we are not collectively tapping into very well. I think there are opportunities to show where we are very well having taking care of our raptors and having energy development, and we need to celebrate those stories and think out of the box. The fact that we are all gathered here today is something that we should be promoting and letting people know about. So I think we just need to take better advantage of the opportunities in front of us.
I would say another opportunity would be the example we heard about earlier with Debugpea, for example. You have a wide variety of collaborators and stakeholders in that. You've got a tremendous energy partnership in that, but you also have a strong ranching community that maintains the open spaces. And as Tim was saying, it's a constituency in and of itself. There's opportunities for folks not currently involved in that, and even if it isn't that program, look for opportunities to participate in or somehow support, whether it's financially or offering your lands for conservation measures to be implemented on. But just look for ways to partner with unconventional colleagues that help look beyond the moment, because long after we're gone, we will have mined all the coal out of here and all the oil will be gone. And what will we have left for the folks that come long after we do? It's going to be the natural resources, the wildlife populations, the open spaces that will allow generations to come to contribute to Wyoming's economy in a very meaningful way. So I would say have a long-term vision, but also look for short-term opportunities to collaborate with folks you might not have thought about on the front end that can help feed both strong industries for the state.
One last question behind you. Well, I'll go 2.
I'm Dave Ackerman. I worked on the ground the last 9 years chasing birds as a consultant for energy companies. And 32 years prior to that, I worked for the Game and Fish Department. So I kind of developed an appreciation for the way the wheels turn or fail to turn, and maybe some of those mechanisms that tend to grease the wheels. And I've got to say that having a symposium like this is something that's very important to the energy industry and to science in general, that we are greasing the wheels. We're trying to do something. A central repository for data is something that for the last 9 years chasing birds, to me as a biologist, it's really important. Dwayne talks about the circles on the map, the buffer zones. Energy industry looks at these maps and the individual circles as potential impediments to development. And I see one of the problems, and Gary can address this, he did it yesterday through the needs for database management. There's a lot of bad circles on those maps, and I personally am responsible for a lot of the circles on the maps because I found a lot of those nests. But we need to develop some kind of a guideline for getting rid of circles that shouldn't be there. We talk about them at every meeting. How many years does a nest have to be gone before it's gone? Probably 10% of the information from the Buffalo BLM database is nests that have been gone for years. I don't want to get into the magpie talk, but if people want to talk about it, we could do that too. Anyway, if you could address some of that, please. Thank you.
Well, from a data science perspective, once an observation is made, it goes into the database and it stays in the database. We have records in our database right now of wildlife observations that were made in Wyoming, from the late 19th century. We have observations of rare plants. We actually entered a record of a plant that was collected during an 1830s expedition through central Wyoming. What botanists were doing in 1834 in central Wyoming, I have no idea unless they were lost. But these are legitimate records. And so, the bad circles, I would say we have to distinguish between true errors, which we don't want in the database if we can identify them as true errors, and inactive nests, which we still do want in the database. But we have to make sure people understand when that pops up on a map of raw data, that's just raw data. That's not a map of active nests. That's a map of all nests that have ever been documented. And so, it's the difference between data and information, like we were talking about yesterday. If you want a map of active nests, the database will be able to give that to you. You can filter based on date of last known activity at that nest. And then there will suddenly be a lot fewer circles there, and you'll be able to modulate what that data is. Active in the last 3 years, active in the last 5, active in the last 10. You can make that choice. But I think it's important to distinguish between bad records and old records. We want to keep old records. We want to get rid of bad ones.
Yeah, I'd like to second that, and I'd like to say that your data is still valuable, and what your data is not a nest buffer. Your data is a nest location, a historical nest location, which is usable for understanding territory use, and a lot of, again, the focus in the future, and what we're looking for in conservation is really territory occupancy, and nests are something that help inform that. And so again, the question isn't should your data be in the database, because it is data, as Gary said, it's valuable. The question is, what is the question you're asking of the database?
Right, and how do you filter that data to answer that question? That's exactly right.
So thank you for your work for filling the database up with that type of information, because we need that as well.
Commissioner, you get the last question.
Thanks, Ryan. I want to take a couple seconds. So if I touch on something that you already have, just advise. I had to go get my tooth filled, so if I start drooling too, that's the other purpose of this here. So 2 things. First, I want to thank you guys for being here, and I want to address, I know that there was some pushback initially from some people. They're like, we need to talk science. We should never talk policy. And I want to address that because, like, what I think from the county's perspective, if we were only interested in policy, we wouldn't convene a symposium like this of scientists. We wouldn't have done it 2 years ago. We wouldn't do it this year again. If we were strictly interested in policy, we would address that at the DC level. And that's not our goal. Everybody in our group wants to protect the birds, but we also want to look at new options for mitigation. So we want to look at alternative strategies. We want to look at doing things a little bit different. And we want to figure out a way to allow industry to develop cost effectively while at the same time protecting the birds. And I would say in some situations that what we're doing now doesn't accomplish either. And so I want to leave a couple tasks that I'd like to make sure don't get forgotten as we leave here is kind of where I'm going with this. But my first question is, how do we get from a discussion where Dr. Beauvais talked about a biologist looking at a species as a whole versus one individual nest. But when it comes to raptors, we look at one individual nest as opposed to broader species viability. So I'd like to know, one, how we get past that, because example I will give you is an example I shared with somebody last night. There was it's a bald eagle. I realize it's different than the traditional raptor, but the situation would have been exactly the same. There was an oil company wanted to drill a well in Campbell County. The rancher, private surface. One thing you will find out about Campbell County, more split estate issues here than anywhere else. So, private landowner, there was a methane well that used to be there, half-mile long road. Pod was at the end of that road. He said, that's fine, use the existing road, drill the well there. Well, there was also a old windmill that had been there. Windmill had been shut down when the methane went in because there was water. Eagle built nest in windmill. And then you come to the situation where nobody knows exactly what's going to happen with that bird. They don't know if the bird will go around the rig to do it. They don't know with the road passing between there and the prey what's going to happen. Any number of other things. So instead of a half-mile long road, built a 7-mile road that looks like one of these things that comes back around. So I don't think anybody could say that that 7-mile road was in the best interest of the species as a whole because of the land disturbance, the increased traffic, the dust, any number of things, but that decision was driven by the fact that you couldn't interrupt one bird. So how do we get to that next step? And is it something that we have to address is it something that requires legislation based on like what Governor Friedenthal was saying? The Migratory Bird Treaty Act really doesn't allow take, and it's about one bird as opposed to a species? Or is it something that you guys, as some of the agencies, have flexibility now to do that? And then 2, how do we figure out to make the groups work and collaborate better? Because I'm cooperating agency liaison on one project, and it's going very well. I think that the company has brought forward some good ideas, and BLM Forest Service are working on it. But it sits between Campbell and Converse County, so that well ends up there, or let's say there's a nest with a buffer. There's going to be a 1-mile buffer on the Campbell side, there's going to be a half-mile buffer on the Converse side. And everybody said this in the meeting, and then the Forest Service guy raises his hand and says, no, if it's on Forest Service land, it's going to be our buffer. So there needs to be some sort of standardization, and the new BLM director, Mary Jo, was very good about wanting to look at some of those things, but how do we get that broader application? And then after that, I have one question that is more logistics, so we can take this information and move it on after the symposium.
Well, I think we look at it more holistically when we have situations brought in as a package of a project proposal as opposed to each individual well being addressed. It does allow you to look at that planning and understand those differences and come up with a potential solution for both of those differences. You know, to repeat myself for at least the 4th time, Tim and I in every BLM office will say, you know, we got to be in conformance with our plan. So right off the bat, we set up the conflict between the 3. The idea then is to look at that and come up with a potential idea for coming up with that with that solution. As far as the first situation goes, you know, we have a little latitude. I tell you though, is it really worth the time on the Eagle one on the windmill? We just got to figure out, is it worth the time to go through that process to deal with that situation versus unfortunately building a 7-mile road, coming up with the impacts and balancing that there. And so that's a decision that the project proponent can make, saying, you know what, I want to do this. I mean, probably before we're done, the eagle will have hatched, they'll float off, and then you can put your road in. But so there is a mechanism to deal with it. It's just not quick.
Well, you know, and I would say that too. I don't really know this situation, and I would probably ask for more information about that, the specifics there. But again, there's flexibility on both sides, and one is, as Dwayne was saying, usually that nesting season isn't that long, and there could be a delay of a couple of months in drilling a well or something like that. And so, you know, we also ask for that flexibility on your side. But again, if it's a situation where it's just a road and it's just vehicular traffic, you know, there's possibilities that that's not a disturbance to those eagles. And that's where, when I was talking about really understanding what those impacts are to those species, it's important to really have clearly identified impacts. And again, in getting us to work together and not having to deal with multiple recommendations from different agencies, that is something that can be addressed through planning processes as well. And in these migratory bird conservation plans, when we're asked to work together, we're going to come forward to you and to industry and say, here's a recommendation for this project area, for this EIS area, through this plan, and it's one. You know, it's not several different ones coming from the agencies. It's specific to that plan, and we've worked together in order to get to that point. So those are the possibilities for you.
I don't know which one of these is Hans. I guess from the Forest Service's perspective, and I've worked on both those scenarios. I've had both those projects and worked through them on public land. A couple of things in our plan that allow flexibility within the system right now is we have the opportunity to do site-specific plan amendments. So one of the examples that I've used quite a bit is at the Tekla substation down near the mines, we wanted to put in another power line coming into a mine. There was in our standards it says you stay a half-mile away from a ferruginous hawk nest. And so when we looked at that, another one of our guidelines is to try and put our power lines in corridors together. We had a bird nesting in the first power line. We wanted to put a power line right beside it. We went through and did a site-specific plan amendment that says it doesn't make sense to move this power line away from this site when the bird's already in a power line and it's coming into a substation. And so we do have those kinds of opportunities. Also within our plan, within the buffer zones, much of what we have is line of sight. So that when we wrote that, we felt like if you had an oil and gas development happening on one side of a hill, you had a ridge in the other, in between it, the other side of the hill, whether if the eagle was on the other side of the hill, even if it was in the buffer zone, the hill buffers them and they're fine. And so we have some latitudes inside of those. When it becomes a problem where it doesn't fit any of the latitudes we've got built in the plan, then like Trish said, we have opportunities to visit with those folks and see what we can do. There are mechanisms in place that we've used to be able to address it. The bigger problem, the question that you had was, how important is that one bird? From a biologist's standpoint, it becomes very interesting to be able to say, this bird's not important, that bird's important. Today, that's because energy industry, number one, wants to be over here. Tomorrow, industry energy wants to come over here and do something at the next one. So now it's not that one or this one, it's this one behind me. Or pretty soon, you're reacting to the desires of what we as a culture are wanting and not really looking at the populations and trying to decide what's important as a population. You can end up shooting holes in a population, and by the time you realize that you've made Swiss cheese out of it, many times you can be too late for a local population. So it's a real fine line to try and walk, at least in my opinion, as to where we go and how we can deal with some of those when you try to get down to it. Like Gary said, most of us are focused on maintaining the population out there. a lot of times, somebody had the discussion earlier, I think yesterday or today, what happens when you have that anomaly? You did all the right things and the nest fails anyway. That's the situation where I feel more comfortable to say, I'm working on a population. We did all the right things, whatever happened out there, unfortunately, bad things happen. Like Gary said yesterday, you got a webcam up and you've got birds in there and the kids get to see the birds die for whatever reason. You explain that that's how nature works. And so that's where we have to be with those. But those are the birds I tend to look at when I'm trying to deal with a population style.
We're out of time.
Yeah, so then my last question is, what will be the follow-up between all you guys? Because like, everybody's talked about the benefit of Dr. Beauvais' database, but then I also know that there are politics and fiefdoms involved in, like, BLM has their own database, Forest Service has their own database. So are you guys going to, is there going to be a way that everybody's going to just say they're going to put it into this one, or are they going to double enter it between the two, or are you going to periodically download the data between them? But I like to look at the actual logistics of things, and I want to see where it's going to go, because if we don't address those things, it'll never get done.
We've worked with a lot of support from the Game and Fish Department, and we've come to an agreement of basically consolidating the decades of wildlife data that the Game and Fish Department has gathered, and to meld it with the data that Wind has into one source. And so we have an example of how that can happen. You know, I think with the interactions that I've had with Forest Service, both, you know, forests in Region 2 and Region 4 in the state, and all the BLM field offices and the state offices, the desire is there to make one central data clearinghouse. You know, I would like to avoid the dual database situation where there's an exchange of data, because it's easy to say, well, you know, Tim will maintain his database and we'll maintain ours, and we'll just exchange data to make sure they both stay in sync with one another. That never happens. That's a fantasy. We've gone down that road a lot. It's on us. It's on my unit right now to build this database. I really do think if we build it, they will come. I think the data will get in there. We've got 1.8 million records in there right now. In a sense, no one's going to top that, and so it's got a lot of momentum that way. And as far as working with the agencies to get the data in there in an efficient way, the desire is there, the technology's there. I think we can make it happen. You know, the one thing we realize too is, as the database team, we need to make it easy for data to come to us. We don't want to put the effort out there on the data submitters end, because then they just say, I'm not getting paid to do this. I don't have time to do this, and the data never gets to us. We need to figure out how to support ourselves and fund ourselves such that we can do the hard work. Literally, if someone has to mail us a folder of muddy data sheets on paper, great, please do that. We'll find the staff to enter that into the database. But Andrea's going to solve that with her digital data form that everyone always uses everywhere all the time. So.
From the Forest Service's standpoint, Gary and I have worked on this quite a bit together. I have some sensitive data that we've worked through that we're more careful putting in. Much of it tends to resolve around goshawks on the forested end, is less in the prey system, but because the data can't be available for example, falconers, we're not wanting to make that a resource available there. So we have some issues with sensitivity of it. But I think, like Gary said, getting the information to him is one thing. Maintaining a separate data set in my office, I can guarantee right now that's what I'll do, because I turn on my GIS format that shows all of my hawk nests every morning. And that sits on my desk so that as one of the other resource managers walks in and says, hey, we're thinking about doing something over here, I can look at it today. And I've constantly got information coming in from a variety of different resources that, like Gary says, it's a time issue. It truly is a time management issue that I've got stuff stacking up here. Well, I can keep that and keep it focused at the end of the year when we're outside of our breeding seasons, where, you know, this time of year biologists are counting anything we can count. And so that's the issue for us, is getting at the end of the season, trying to get it to Gary. But in the meantime, I've got new data that's sitting on my desk that gets into my system. I can't send it to him and wait for it to come back again to be able to be using it. And so, yes, to be real honest with you, I will keep a separate data set. Try to share the stuff and keep it out there as current as we possibly can. But it's to keep me in real time, I'll have a separate data set and feed the data as we can.
I think that's the way to look at it is the real-time needs and a lag between when data is collected and when we get it. There are some technical solutions to this too. I mean, we can post our data on the web such that when you open your database in the morning of hawk nests, it's actually reaching over the web, piping the data out of our central database and putting it up on your project. And keeping it up to date that way. So there are some technical ways to reduce that lag time. There's always going to be that lag time.
I like his system of computers better than mine.
Well, that's the other, yeah. I don't understand Forest Service. My wife works for the Forest Service, and she's constantly complaining about the Forest Service computer system.
The technology is there to reach across. The equipment that we're using not necessarily every day does that.
She talks about getting the diesel conversion unit on her computer because it still literally runs on coal right now. She has to shovel it in the back, and
I would say for BLM, we have a number of agreements with the State of Wyoming, University of Wyoming, Game and Fish, et cetera, and most likely we appear to be moving in towards definitely having common databases as much as we can.
Thank you. If you'll join me in thanking our panel. While the panel is breaking up, I want to thank you and just summarize a couple of things before we adjourn for the afternoon. I want to just review for 2 minutes what we did, how we started this. We started with a current governor and an untethered former governor for their positions on introducing this. From there, we went to the science and data, the background of it, the data needs, the existing data, the data models, and then started talking about the policy. And I think that's what the commissioners were interested in, and it was a focus on science and data, and then transform into some policy. And then this last panel was really fabulous in terms of looking about the next steps and giving us a task list, giving us some things that we can do. Before I turn it over to Chairman Bell, there's one other thing. Ivy is going to send out a survey to all the attendees and participants, just a review of how you thought things were done and what things we could do better next time, and also suggestions for next steps. So thank everybody for coming, and then Chairman Bell is going to close this out.
Thank you, Gregory. And I just wanted to echo the thank yous, especially to Ivy and Beth, who have kind of done the legwork on a lot of this, and especially when things are happening here, I want to just make sure we thank them, Ivy and Beth from our office, and ERG for putting this on. And when we had this discussion about 6 months ago about, well, are we going to have another Raptor Symposium? The discussion was, well, maybe somebody else is going to step up and do it. Well, I don't see that happens, so I'm guessing in about 2 years we'll be following up again. So thank you everybody for participating. Hopefully we can keep the momentum rolling, and everybody travel safe, and thank you a lot for participating in this Raptor Symposium.